Could you elaborate for our audience on what you see as the core issues in U.S.-South Korea relations? Because my audience basically think Lee Jae-myung is a good guy, obviously comparing to Yoon, right, and his economic and political stance, saying even if his support rate dropping to 1%, he will support Japan and raising all the historical atrocity what Japanese did, anyways, and saying the Korean government would devote and pay money for the comfort women, which are Japanese invader sex slaves, right? It's ridiculous. So comparing to Yoon, my audience think Lee Jae-myung is a good guy. But you guys made an article criticizing on his policies. Would you elaborate on why?
I think for Lee Jae-myung, it's a very similar situation. There was a very strong progressive movement, popular movement that was comprised of farmers, of students, of young women, of seniors who are like very heavily affected by elderly poverty in South Korea, of the unionized workforce who were really pushing for Yoon Suk-yeol's ouster, for the defense of the democratic system. But beyond those things, they were not just fighting a kind of rearguard action. They were really pushing forward this idea of total social transformation. They wanted a more egalitarian society where working people, in their terminology, were the masters of society, right? However, what has ended up happening is that Lee Jae-myung has now benefited from what is called the Revolution of Light, this movement to oust Yoon Suk-yeol. But he is actually not he's actually not a real representative of that agenda, I think we can argue. There are some ways in which he does want to make progress on various social fronts, including for workers' rights, and there actually have been some measures that have been successfully taken in the last couple of months in order to achieve that, and I think that credit needs to be given where it's due. At the same time, the fundamental issue facing South Korea, I think we would argue, is the alliance with the United States, and particularly the military alliance, which exists to protect the interests of both the Korean bourgeoisie and the US imperialists. I think the essential thing to understand is that South Korea has more or less been occupied uninterrupted by the US since the end of World War II. So this is now 80 years of US occupation in South Korea. Today, there's 62 US military bases at least throughout South Korea. The largest overseas US military base anywhere in the world is located in South Korea. There are 28,000 US troops in South Korea. They are largely protected from prosecution under Korean law. They more or less enjoy rights to extraterritoriality like you would have found in the 19th century in China or in Joseon Dynasty Korea from like the Western powers, right? And there is a very important economic partnership between the ruling class of these countries because, of course, it's the U.S. that is covering the military and security costs of Korean capitalism, which exploits the masses of people. It also, at this point, because these conglomerates have gotten so big, is exploiting people overseas. And it is enriching, those who who have private ownership of those means of production. Lee Jae-myung, as a president, is not really seeking to rock that relationship in any kind of way. And I think what that has resulted in is Donald Trump's ability to execute this very predatory agenda against South Korea, where he's essentially trying to bleed the country dry, right? As he's done with many other so-called U.S. allies, right? He wants these massive sums of investment to be ponied up. At this point, as I mentioned before, we're talking 350 billion in public backed, 150 billion from the private sector. That's $500 billion. It doesn't end there, actually. Lee Jae-myung also agreed to $100 billion purchase of U.S. liquid natural gas, which will start in 2028 and last for the next decade. And so these are basically massive infusions of wealth that transfer from the pockets of working people in Korea to Wall Street, right? To the financiers in the United States, right? So I think just as we saw under the Obama administration and the Bush administration after 2008, when there were these big bailout packages that primarily benefited the big capitalists in the U.S. at the expense of working people. Now Trump is pursuing an agenda where he's essentially recreating that, but doing it with the treasuries of countries around the world, including South Korea. And so this is essentially a massive system of robbery that's being undertaken. And while the Lee Jae-myung administration has tried to kind of pass off its efforts as successful by saying things like, oh, we got the tariffs down from 25% to 15%, you know, South Korea and the US were in a free trade agreement. Prior to that, there were functionally no tariffs, right, on South Korean goods entering the US. And so you can't say, oh, like we brought the tariffs down because the tariffs still increased. And in order to actually bring them down, quote unquote, to 15%, you've given up now more than $500 billion, right? More than half of the annual budget of South Korea, and more than a third of the annual GDP, right? So these are massive sums of capital that are now being moved to the US that are essentially being stolen from the Korean people. And so I think, it's this kind of organized robbery that we're pointing out in the first place on the economic front.